The guns stopped firing in Europe in May of 1945, but the war did not end. Not really. Berlin was nothing but broken stone and smoke. Hitler was dead. Soldiers hugged each other in the streets, believing the nightmare was over. But in the silence that followed the last gunshot, something far more dangerous was beginning. Two men were now staring at each other across a shattered continent. One was Joseph Stalin, ruler of the Soviet Union, whose armies now occupied half of Europe. The other was General George S. Patton, the fastest and most aggressive commander the United States had ever produced. They were supposed to be allies, but neither believed it. Stalin had defeated Hitler at a terrible cost. More than 20 million Soviets were dead, cities were burned, families erased. Yet the Red Army stood victorious from the Baltic Sea to the heart of Germany. To Stalin, that meant those lands belonged to him. Patton saw it very differently. He had watched Soviet troops move into Poland, Hungary, Romania, and East Germany. He had seen communist governments installed. He had heard reports of arrests, disappearances, and deportations. Patton did not see liberation. He saw conquest. In his command tent in Germany, Patton stared at maps late into the night. He traced the lines of Soviet occupation with his finger. He measured distances. He studied roads, bridges, railways. He was no longer planning how to defeat the Nazis. He was planning how to stop Stalin. In private conversations with his staff, Patton said something that stunned them. "We fought the wrong enemy." Those words traveled. British officers heard them. American journalists repeated them. Intelligence agents wrote them down. And soon, they were sitting on Stalin's desk in Moscow. Stalin read them carefully. Patton was not like the other Western generals. Eisenhower was cautious. Montgomery was slow and methodical. But Patton was a predator. Stalin understood predators. They do not wait, they strike. That made Patton the most dangerous man in Europe. Soviet intelligence was ordered to watch him closely. Every move of Patton's army was tracked. Every conversation intercepted. Every speech analyzed. What they discovered frightened Stalin. Patton was obsessed with speed. His tanks could move faster than the Red Army could react. His supply lines were unmatched. His air support dominated the skies. If Patton attacked east, he could smash deep into Soviet territory before Moscow could even organize a defense. The Red Army was enormous, but exhausted. Millions of soldiers were wounded or dead. Equipment was worn. Supplies were thin. Stalin knew that in 1945, the Soviet Union was not ready for another war. And Patton knew it too. The most dangerous moment came in Czechoslovakia. Prague was the last major city in Central Europe not yet taken by the Soviets. Patton's Third Army was racing toward it. Soviet forces were coming from the east. Whoever arrived first would control the country. Patton wanted Prague. Stalin demanded it. American commanders were ordered to stop. Patton ignored them. His tanks moved forward anyway. American and Soviet forces came within hours of meeting each other. Nervous soldiers on both sides loaded their weapons. No one knew if the next order would be to fire. The world was seconds from a new war. At the last moment, diplomats intervened. Patton was ordered to halt. The Soviets entered Prague. Stalin had won that round. But he never forgot how close Patton had come. From that day forward, Stalin became obsessed with one idea. George S. Patton must be stopped. Back in Germany, Patton grew increasingly angry. He saw Eastern Europe falling behind the Iron Curtain. He saw Soviet troops installing puppet governments. He saw civilians being dragged away. He called it tyranny. Washington called it politics. Patton called it betrayal. His outspoken nature became his weakness. Stories about his temper, his controversial remarks, and his refusal to follow orders began to circulate. Slowly, quietly, Patton was pushed aside. The general who could have challenged Stalin was removed from the center of power. And then came the accident. A strange car crash, a sudden injury, a rapid decline. Patton was dead. In Moscow, Stalin allowed himself a moment of relief. The one man who had truly frightened him was gone. But the secret war Patton had begun did not end with his death. It simply went underground. The Cold War was born. NATO, the Warsaw Pact, the Berlin Wall, the nuclear arms race. All of it grew from the silent struggle between two men who never fought but nearly destroyed the world. The war after Hitler was not fought with bullets. It was fought with fear, and it began with Patton and Stalin. After Patton's death, the world pretended everything was normal. Newspapers called it an accident. Politicians spoke of peace. Soldiers were told the war was over. But inside the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin did not believe in accidents. He had lived too long, killed too many, survived too much. Men like Patton did not simply disappear. They were removed. Stalin ordered a quiet investigation through his intelligence network. Soviet agents across Europe were told to watch the Americans even more closely. If Patton was truly gone, then his ideas would remain. And ideas, Stalin knew, were more dangerous than armies. What Soviet intelligence discovered only deepened his fear. Patton's former officers still spoke his name in hushed voices. His strategies were being studied inside NATO planning rooms. His philosophy, speed, shock, deep strikes, was becoming doctrine. The man was dead, but his war plan was alive. The Soviet Union was exhausted. Cities were still rubble. Farms were burned. Factories were barely operating. Stalin knew that if the West attacked now, the Red Army might collapse. So he did the only thing he could. He bought time. Eastern Europe was turned into a massive buffer zone. Communist governments were installed overnight. Secret police crushed opposition. Borders were sealed. Railways were rebuilt not for people, but for tanks. Stalin was building a wall of steel between himself and Patton's ghost. In Washington, American leaders were beginning to understand what Patton had seen first. The Soviets were not leaving. Europe was being split in two. But unlike Patton, they were afraid of another war. And Stalin knew it. The secret war had entered its most dangerous phase. The world called it the Cold War, but to the men who lived through it, it was anything but cold. Berlin became the front line. One city, two armies, one wrong move from disaster. American planes flew in supplies. Soviet guns tracked them from the ground. Everyone waited for someone to blink. They did not. Then came Korea, then Vietnam, then nuclear missiles. The war Patton had predicted did not begin in Europe. It spread across the globe. Stalin never stopped preparing for the invasion he believed was coming. He built the largest military machine in history. He armed it with nuclear weapons. He drilled it to move west at a moment's notice. All because of one American general who had dared to speak the truth. When Stalin died, the fear he had lived with did not die with him. His successors inherited it. They kept the armies. They kept the missiles. They kept the walls. Because Patton's shadow still loomed over Europe, and the most terrifying thing of all was that he might have been right. The moment Patton's body was lowered into the ground, the world believed it had buried the last danger of the war. But Stalin did not. From his office in the Kremlin, he stared at the rain falling over Moscow and whispered something only his closest aide heard. Now the war becomes invisible. Stalin knew something few men on earth understood. When armies stop firing, the most dangerous conflicts begin. Hitler was gone. Germany was broken. But the Red Army stood deeper inside Europe than any Russian force in history. Stalin believed this was his greatest victory and his greatest risk. Because across the ruins of Germany stood millions of American and British soldiers, and behind them an industrial machine untouched by war. And at the center of that machine had been one man who truly understood how to use it. Patton. Stalin feared. Patton not because he was reckless, but because he was logical. Patton had seen the numbers. He knew the Red Army was bleeding. He knew Soviet supply lines were stretched. He knew Eastern Europe was unstable. Patton understood that history had handed the West a brief window to stop the Soviet Empire before it was fully built, and Stalin knew Patton wanted to use it. The Soviet leader's paranoia was not madness. It was mathematics. Stalin ordered new intelligence units formed specifically to track the Americans. They were not hunting for spies. They were hunting for intentions. Every train moving west, every convoy, every airfield expansion was carefully recorded. Soviet analysts mapped American tank divisions as if they were already invading. What they saw was terrifying. American armored units could cross Germany in days. The Red Army would need weeks to respond. Stalin realized something horrifying. Patton had been right. In 1945, the Soviet Union could not win a conventional war against the West. So Stalin changed the game. He did not demobilize. He militarized. Entire industries were moved behind the Urals. Millions of conscripts were kept under arms. New tanks and artillery were rushed into production. Cities were rebuilt around military needs. Eastern Europe became a fortress. Poland, Hungary, Romania, East Germany. Each was turned into a buffer zone soaked in Soviet blood and steel. Stalin knew if war came, it would be fought there first. The Iron Curtain was not built out of ideology. It was built out of fear. In Washington, American leaders debated endlessly. They saw Soviet expansion. They saw Stalin's grip tightening, but they were terrified of another war. Patton had not been. That made him dangerous. So the men who followed him tried to fight the same war in a different way. They called it containment. Stalin called it preparation. The world stood balanced on a knife. Every crisis was another step closer to the fire. Berlin, Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, the secret war. Patton and Stalin had started spread across the planet. Two superpowers circling each other like predators. Neither daring to strike. Both ready to? In the end, Patton never got his war. Stalin never got his peace. And the world lived under the shadow of what almost happened. Because when two men see the future clearly and refuse to accept it, their conflict can last longer than their lives. When George Patton died, the world lost a general. When Stalin learned of his death, he lost his sleep. The Kremlin announced nothing. No celebrations. No statements. Stalin simply sat in his office long after midnight, staring at the map of Europe pinned to his wall. A red pencil marked every city the Red Army occupied. A blue pencil marked every American airfield. Between them was a thin black line. That line was all that stood between peace and extinction. Stalin understood something that Western politicians did not. Wars do not begin when men declare them. They begin when fear becomes stronger than restraint. And Stalin was afraid. Patton had been the only Western commander who spoke openly about the truth Stalin lived with every day, that the alliance against Hitler was a lie. It was a temporary truce between enemies who knew they would one day fight. Patton was the first man in the West who was honest enough to say it. That honesty made him dangerous. When Soviet intelligence confirmed Patton was gone, Stalin ordered something that shocked his own generals. Assume he is still alive. They did not understand. Stalin explained quietly, a man can die. His ideas do not. From that moment forward, every American tank was Patton. Every NATO exercise was Patton. Every Western military doctrine was Patton. The ghost of the general became more powerful than the man. Inside the Soviet High Command, fear shaped every decision. Officers who suggested reducing military spending were removed. Generals who spoke of compromise were watched. Diplomats who spoke too warmly of the West disappeared. Stalin was not building an army. He was building a shield, because he believed Patton's war was still coming. Across Europe, people felt it in their bones. Borders hardened. Travel became dangerous. Conversations became cautious. The freedom that had briefly returned in 1945 vanished under the weight of surveillance and suspicion. Eastern Europe became a prison not because Stalin loved control, but because he feared invasion. He knew how quickly Patton had destroyed Germany. He knew the same thing could happen to the Soviet Union. In the West, Patton's former officers gathered quietly. They met in military schools, war colleges, and private rooms. They spoke of him not as a man, but as a warning. "If we ever fight the Soviets," one of them said, "it will be Patton's war." The Pentagon studied maps the same way Patton once had. Roads, bridges, supply lines. How fast could tanks reach Warsaw? How quickly could bombers reach Moscow? These were not academic exercises. They were rehearsals. Stalin's spies delivered these plans to the Kremlin. Every report tightened his chest. The Cold War was not cold. It was restrained. Like two gunmen staring at each other across a narrow street, fingers on the trigger. And behind one of them stood the ghost of a general who never stopped wanting to fire. Stalin ruled with terror. Patton ruled with vision. And that was why Stalin feared him more than any enemy he had ever faced. Because Patton did not hate the Soviet Union. He understood it. And in war, understanding your enemy is more powerful than hating them. The winter of 1946 was colder than any in living memory. In Moscow, the snow fell like ash from an invisible fire. Joseph Stalin stood by the tall window of the Kremlin, watching soldiers march across Red Square. They were young, too young. Many had never known peace. Their fathers had died in the war against Hitler. Their mothers waited in broken villages. This was the army Stalin would have to use if Patton came. Every night, Stalin studied maps of Europe the way a gambler studies cards. Germany was split. Poland was a battlefield without fighting. Czechoslovakia was trembling. He knew that if war erupted, it would not be announced with speeches. It would begin with tanks. Stalin's generals begged him to let the country rest. He refused. "Rest is death," he told them. The West does not rest. They did not understand that he was not afraid of America. He was afraid of Patton. Even in death, Patton had become something more than a man. He was an idea. An idea that said the Soviet Union could be defeated. That was poison. In Washington, a young generation of officers was being trained. They had not fought in Normandy or the Ardennes, but they studied those battles obsessively. They studied Patton. They learned how his tanks broke through German lines, how his supply officers kept the army moving, how his pilots cleared the skies. To them, Patton was not reckless. He was brilliant. NATO was formed. Stalin felt it like a knife. This was not a defensive alliance. It was a ring tightening around his empire. Soviet intelligence warned him. American forces could be at the Polish border within days if they chose to move. Stalin ordered more troops into East Germany. The Iron Curtain descended. Families were separated. Borders sealed. Europe was cut in two. All because one man had once dared to say the truth out loud. The Cold War was not built on ideology. It was built on fear. Fear that Patton's war would one day begin. Stalin died still believing it. And the world lived in the shadow of that belief for decades.